Don't go on a deserted road at night.
In the small town of Ravendale, nestled between dense forests and rolling hills, there was an old saying, "Don't go on a deserted road at night." It wasn't just a cautionary tale told by parents to scare their children. It was a warning deeply embedded in the town's history. Stories about strange occurrences, vanishing travelers, and eerie noises had been passed down for generations. But like most urban legends, not everyone believed it. James, a young man in his 20s, had recently moved to Ravendale to work at a local mechanic's shop. He wasn't one to believe in ghost stories or superstitions. To him, the deserted road that snaked through the forest on the outskirts of town was just another stretch of asphalt. He had heard the warnings, of course, from his co-workers and neighbors. They spoke about the whispers in the trees, the flickering lights that appeared out of nowhere, and the shadowy figures that followed those who dared to walk or drive through it after dark. James would laugh it off, teasing them for their overactive imaginations. One chilly autumn evening, James stayed late at the shop, finishing up repairs on an old truck. By the time he was done, it was well past midnight. As he locked up and got into his car, he realized he could either take the long way home through the main road or cut his drive in half by taking the deserted road through the forest. The choice was obvious to him. Smirking at the thought of all the warnings he'd heard, he muttered to himself, "It's just a road," and turned onto the forbidden path. The road was as quiet and desolate as everyone had described. Tall, gnarled trees lined either side, their branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. The headlights of James's car barely pierced the inky darkness. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. At first, it felt uneventful, almost peaceful, but as he drove deeper into the forest, an unsettling feeling began to creep over him. James couldn't explain it, but he felt as though he was being watched. He glanced at his rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or a figure behind him, but the road remained empty. Shaking his head, he dismissed a feeling of paranoia fueled by the stories he'd heard. Yet, the unease only grew. A few miles in, his car radio crackled to life. Even though he hadn't turned it on, static filled the car, punctuated by faint whispers that were impossible to make out. James frowned and reached for the knob to turn it off. But as soon as his fingers touched it, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing down on him like a weight. Just as he began to relax, something darted across the road ahead of him. He slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding, squinting into the darkness. He saw nothing, no animal, no person, nothing that could have caused the movement. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to keep going. A few minutes later, the air inside the car grew colder, enough for James to see his breath. The heater, which had been working fine moments ago, now seemed completely dead. Shivering, he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The trees outside appeared closer, their twisted branches almost scraping against the car as he passed. Then he saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair hanging in matted strands over her face. She stood motionless, facing his car. James's heart raced as he pressed on the horn, but the sound was muted, almost as if the car itself had lost its voice. The woman didn't move. James's instincts screamed at him to turn round, but the narrow road offered no space to do so. He decided to drive forward slowly, hoping she would step aside. As he approached, the woman lifted her head, revealing hollow, empty eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. Terrified, James swerved to avoid her, his car skidding off the road and into a ditch. The impact jolted him, but he was unharmed. Shaking, he looked back at the road, expecting to see the woman, but she was gone. The forest was silent again, and naturally so. Gathering his courage, James tried to restart the car, but the engine refused to turn over. He reached for his phone, only to find that it had no signal. Steeling himself, James decided to walk back to town. As he stepped onto the road, he felt a chill run down his spine. The trees seemed to close in around him, and every shadow felt alive. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to look back. Even when he heard soft footsteps behind him, the whispers started again, faint at first but growing louder with each step he took. They weren't in any language he recognized, but their tone was filled with malice. His pace quickened, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and the whispers fell silent. James froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. Slowly, he turned around. Standing a few feet away was the woman in white, her hollow eyes now glowing faintly. She raised a hand and pointed at him, her lips moving soundlessly. James didn't wait to find out what she wanted. He turned and ran as fast as he could, the road stretching endlessly before him. It felt like hours before he finally saw the faint lights of the town in the distance. Exhausted and trembling, He collapsed on the doorstep of the first house he reached. The next morning, James woke up in the town clinic. The locals who found him had heard his frantic knocks and brought him inside. When they asked what had happened, he could only shake his head, too shaken to speak.
From that day on, James never doubted the warnings about the deserted road. He moved out of Ravendale a month later, but the memory of that night haunted him forever. And though he tried to forget, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the shadows of the forest, the woman in white was still watching him.